Hi everyone and welcome to a Luca lecture. Today I would like to talk about Henri Matisse, usually considered one of the more important artists of the 20th century. Along with Pablo Picasso, Matisse is usually thought of as one of the principal people in really changing the dynamic and vocabulary of modern art. Matisse was born in 1869 in the northern part of France. His father was a grain merchant, which means he came from an upper middle class family. He originally pursued a career in law, and then while he was sick and bedridden, he started painting from a paint kit that his mother had actually given him. From here, he really started to dream of becoming an artist, and eventually, to his father's dismay, gave up his law practice in the pursuit of art. We have two early artists that influenced Matisse. First, he was a student of Gustave Moreau at the Académie Julian in Paris, and then later on he travels to Brittany and actually studies with John Peter Russell, an Australian artist. When we look at the work of these artists in comparison to what we have from Matisse, we can definitely see the early influences that he got from his teachers. When we look at Moreau, Moreau painted in a symbolist fashion, so it's a very kind of classical feel, but you'll notice this kind of romantic posturing within the paintings, and again, this kind of sense of fantasy that I think Matisse took with him into his own work much later on. When we look at his paintings that he did in Gustave Moreau's studio, most of them are just studies, like this one of a nude, but we already see this kind of style of the time of Impressionism where we don't have this completion of a lot of the visual information that you would normally see in, say, a photograph. With Woman Reading, it's a beautiful, lush interior, and I think it's interesting again that he's chosen to paint the back of a woman and paint essentially a still life around her, making it a little bit easier in his formative years of early painting. The other important figure that we have is John Russell, who is actually an Australian artist who was living in England at the time. He's important for many reasons, but he was friends with Vincent van Gogh and actually introduced Matisse to a lot of Van Gogh's work and also some of the post-impressionist art style. In particular, you'll notice the style within his own work, and I always think that Russell is one of these artists that's very much overlooked from this period as kind of this transitional figure between what we think of as Impressionism to Post-Impressionism, where we have early works like the one we just saw, but then we have works like this one where he's really kind of going into this post-impressionistic vein, doing these very, very large areas of color. And again, if we think of Matisse and we think of particularly of his later work, we definitely see an influence here in John Russell. In the next chapter of Matisse's life, we see him having a daughter with one of his models, and then he will go on to marry a different woman in 1898 by the name of Amelia. They will have two sons together, Jean and Pierre, and this is kind of the establishment of his family. He will then go on a series of trips, first to London by way of the advice of Camille Pissarro, and then he'll travel a bit more, making his way back to London, and then eventually his way back to France. When we look at his work from this period, we see Matisse bringing together all of his different influences and really honing what he wanted to say with his work. When we look at this study, it almost seems like it's pointillist in nature, with large blobs of color indicating different tones within the work. And we don't see a lot of this until he gets back to working with a few other artists, including Storan. Here we have another wonderful example of his early work where again, we have a still life and it has this sense of normalcy, but we start to see these flaring of colors that I really do associate with Matisse. He's one of these wonderful artists that finds hidden colors in places and is able to bring them out. What we see is definitely less of an attention to what lines and a lot of the other formal qualities that would give us some type of indication of definitiveness, of solidness, and instead we have this very openness of brushstroke that we really do kind of associate and think of as being from the Impressionist. And it's important to remember that the effect of the Impressionists on this generation of artists, and a lot of the artists from this period are working their way out of that Impressionist style and finding new roads and new avenues by way of it forward. And I think that Matisse is an excellent example of one of these artists. Here we have a vase of sunflowers, and it's very hard not to think about Vincent van Gogh whenever we see sunflowers. But when we look at this, you can see these thick kind of slobs of paint that he's putting on, very much like Van Gogh would. So he's looking at different artists, and he's also honing specifically what he wants to say with his work. The other thing noticeable from this period is the number of still lifes that Matisse is painting, and this might be by way of him still being kind of a younger artist and working his way up to other compositions. Still lifes are very easy to create and are very easy for artists because they're always there and don't have any sense of movement. And from this, maybe he's learning to find all of these little extra colors that I keep mentioning in his still lifes, but it is noticeable that this is one of the major themes of his early work. In 1904, we start to see the first successes in the career of Matisse. He has his first exhibition at the Ambroise Vollard Gallery. It's also in 1904 that he works with André Derain and creates the Fauves in 3 different exhibitions. We also see him traveling to a tropical island, Saint-Tropez, with Paul Signac. And from André Derain and Signac, we actually have this second level of influences, I think, in his work. We also see him traveling to North Africa, which is also, I think, a very important step in his thinking about art. The other important figure that we have from the Fauve movement is André Derain, and here we have just a little example of his work to kind of put it in reference point to where Matisse is. As I mentioned, I think both Derain and Paul Signac have an influence on this next period of his work. Again, the pointillist style is very famous with Signac, and you can see it creeping its way back into Matisse's paintings. Women with a Hat from 1905 is probably the more famous of his early works from this period, and it really shows the bringing together of all of the different elements we saw before into what we think of as a refined sense of Matisse. Within this painting, as I mentioned, he did a lot of still lifes before this, so we see him working back towards an actual person, but he's using those same kind of flares of colors that we saw him using with the previous still life paintings. What we find in a lot of his work from this period is this just amazing explosion of color, and I wonder if it's because of the people that he was working with and how artists can kind of goad each other on, that he just became more and more unreserved in how he was painting. We have examples like Luxembourg Garden where we have an outdoor scene and we still have this sense of moving back towards some sense of realism, but we have these large packets of color, very much like you would see. I always think of stained glass windows when I'm looking at this type of painting. We also see Matisse approaching many of the subject matters he had gone with before, but in a new way. If you look at this and you think about the earlier still lifes that we had, he's not really blending colors as much. Look at the yellowness of that vase in the background and the yellow of the lemon. Instead of hiding these little colors and having them come forth, now he's just taking the objects and painting them those very, very large solid tones. This carries over also into other works he does when we actually go outside and we start to do landscapes within the city. We almost have this cubist venture looking at Notre Dame. Over these next 2 paintings, we really see the full gambit of what Matisse is trying to accomplish. In this first one, we have a nude very much painted in this style that he's working through where we don't have specifics in terms of realism, and he's leaving packets open, again, for these large areas of color, like the shirt he's wearing in the mirror reflection. But on the other side of the coin, we have paintings like this that are highly influenced by Paul Signac, but this is this pointillist style again, and we start to see the forms of people that we will see much later in some of his more famous paintings, where he's really simplified people down to almost just an outline of a form with this sense of color. Here I have a newspaper from one of the Fauve exhibitions, and you can see the work that was actually featured, including Matisse's Woman with a Hat there on the left. Again, when we think about all of these works being seen together, we see this kind of transformative process that Matisse went through by working with the other artists in the Fauve period. And coming out the other side of that, we have paintings like this, where to me this is an early representation of what he'll do later with collage, where he's actually just leaving large open areas within the canvas itself, not afraid to just leave space, negative space, which is really kind of a positive space in the way that he's treating it, even though he's really not treating it at all. And the paintings from this period are really some of my personal favorites, and I think a lot of people really find a lot of joy from this particular period of Matisse. This beautiful window looking out into the bay with all of these wonderful lush pastel colors that we have both inside and outside, working together in a beautiful fashion. We also have the very, very famous Woman with a Green Stripe from 1905, painted at this period too. This is, of course, his wife, but look at the stylization of her shirt, and just again, these very, very broad, beautiful areas of color that he's willing to create, and the noticeable green stripe down her face as well. The next painting we have, The Joy of Life, I always think of as one of the most important paintings, not only within the career of Matisse, but also within the scope of the 20th century. Why? Well, he's bringing together several different ideas and aspects that we have to pay attention to. The first thing he's doing is his fauve color style that we've seen before is on broad display here, and these are mostly warm tones. Again, it has this pleasant kind of summer vibe to it. You can't really look at this painting and feel a cold chill. It just has this wonderful sense of warmth throughout it. The next thing that you'll notice is that he's using figures that are very close to the figures he was doing with pointillism, but moved a little bit back towards what I think of as realism, where we can definitively see the figures, and again, it almost has this Arcadian sense that you would almost associate with one of the paintings of maybe Hieronymus Bosch within the Garden of Eden or something along those lines. The other very important aspect about this painting is this is a scene that Matisse has made up within his own mind. This is not a scene like the still lifes or the beach scenes or the other landscapes that we've seen before. In all of the other paintings that we've looked at, Matisse has really been looking at something and painting his interpretation of it. Here he's not looking at anything anymore. This is just his pure interpretation of the feeling of the joy of life as he perceives it as an artist. A very important figure in the avant-garde and also the life of Matisse is Sergei Shchukin, a Russian art collector who lived in Paris. He is a massive, massive collector of art, including 50 Picassos, along with multiple pieces, 36 pieces by Matisse, and he will be one of the primary reasons that there's such a wealth of art in the collection of the Russian Empire. Moving on from him, though, you can see that Sergei's influence over the work that Matisse is doing, and a lot of the more famous compositions that we have from this period are actually pieces that were specifically painted for Sergei Shchukin. What we'll also notice with paintings like The Young Sailor from 1906 is the radical change in style and really, really pushing it much more towards the avant-garde. Here we have him again looking at things like models and still lifes and things that we saw before before, but the way that he's treating them is in a radically different manner. When we look at this still life, this is a wonderful example where the still life itself almost gets completely lost in the decoration and the colors and everything else that's occurring within the space of the painting. We can also see a simplification in the human form when he is actually using a model. When we look at this, again, it's almost as if he's taking Cezanne's advice and reducing everything down to just a series of shapes. But again, with this, the human form almost becomes secondary to the overall composition. And when we look at things like the face of the two women here, that simplification becomes more than obvious, where again, that's not what he wants us to focus on. He wants us to focus on the color and the interaction of the lines and the basic formal qualities that we have within a painting. This is a wonderful example, the red turban from 1907, where again we look at the woman, and there's no way we could think of this as being photographic, but the color and the stylization of it still makes it a very attractive and very wonderful painting to enjoy. As we look at the next few paintings, we really do see another one of these moments of synthesis from the different aspects that he's been working on before. And there's a lot of similarities between these paintings, but again, I think Matisse is really centering down on exactly what he wants to say within a work. We go from the previous painting to this one, where we even have this higher sense of stylization within the work itself, and again, not even really this concrete effort to really capture things anymore as you would readily see them, but combining what the artist would see in his mind. So when we look at paintings like Bathers with the Turtle from 1907, we have different aspects working together, but to me, all of these paintings are resting somewhere within reality, and again, the construction of what the artist wants to make. If you look at where most of these folks are existing in, it's this pastoral space, but it's in no way a realistic space. You just have this green field and then two different colors to kind of denote the sky. He's really removed all of that just in favor of the simplicity of the figures, their interaction with each other, their basic forms, and all of this leads into what we would think of as the dance 1 and 2. And I really think of these as being his second real seminal work from this period, other than The Joy of Life, where again, we're going to a fictitious place, but we have this wonderful circle and movement of figures. He was so enamored or so interested in this painting that we actually see it in a few of his other paintings from the time period as he's kind of working on it there sitting in the background. And of course, we also know that there's two different versions of this painting. There's the first one where the figures are pink, but probably the most famous of them is the dance where you have these incredibly crimson red figures, again, really removing any concept of reality, but really creating this wonderful fiction for us to enjoy. The simplicity of the colors, the simplicity of the forms, but the sense that he's able to create this amazing work of art that has this amazing sense of unity and also fluidity to it at the same time. And while most people know of dance, there's actually a sister painting to it that is called Music, that has male figures sitting on a hillside with some of them playing different musical instruments and some of them just sitting and observing us. Again, the two of them directly go together as one unit of both music and dance. We've been focusing a lot on Matisse's paintings, but it should be noted that he also did create sculpture, and he also did some printmaking as well. Very briefly, I just wanted to show us a few of his sculptures, and again, they very much resemble, in my mind, the forms that he's creating at this point within his paintings of the human forms. And again, when you look at things like Reclining Nude, we see direct parallels with some of his paintings, and again, these kind of larger circular forms that he's creating by the way of simplification of the woman's body. Matisse continues to travel, and it's also from this period that we see his relationship with Picasso start to flourish, where each one of them is starting to incorporate some of the concepts and ideas from the other person's studio. It's also from this period that we see some of the most radical paintings from the time by Matisse, including this one where we have a solid black background and then objects kind of painted over the top of it. It's from this period that we have the famous painting The Red Studio, where Matisse has taken the interior of his studio and painted it red. This is a wonderful and fun painting because there's so many other paintings in there, and some of them we've actually seen within this lecture. This painting will have a profound effect on a young Mark Rothko in his direction of what he wants to paint. And beyond the Red Studio, we have paintings like The Conversation, where he's really using one solid color and then kind of working his way back from it in my mind. The Red Studio is obviously red, but here we have this amazing tranquil blue, and it very much affects the mood and feeling of the conversation. As I mentioned, I think that a lot of the works from this period window at Tangiers 1912 is another example of this, where we have this one solid tone, in this case blue, that kind of permeates through the painting and creates this mood, this atmospheric mood that he then goes over the top of and paints other tones or colors. In Portrait of the Artist's Wife from 1913, the artist's wife's face has really been removed down to the sense of a mask, and again, I almost think of Picasso when I see this painting. We see this idea once again in Blue Window, and we also see the incorporation of one of the motifs that we've seen quite a few times already, and that of a window. But here, the interior and exterior spaces are all the same tone, and again, it's hard to distinguish what is the outside and what is the inside space. Uh, Continuing on with this, though, we can see that the blue can also be transferred to things like gray, where when we look at this study of a woman, she looks hardly anything but happy in the space of the painting that Matisse has created, with this very dull kind of gray permeating through most of the composition. We see this use of the window again with interior with goldfish, where we have this sense of the colors both bleeding in and out of the space of the window, leading to, again, these very bright tones that we find in the goldfish and the green plate that's located in the foreground. His love of windows even goes into French Window from 1914, where in the image it looks like a very, very black space, as if we're looking out at night. When you see the actual painting, you can actually see some definition within the black itself, so it's not just this giant black rectangle. And kind of on the reverse of that, we have this incredibly bright yellow from the yellow curtain, where we're almost moving to the point of just pure decoration, in my opinion, and this is really almost a preview of what we will see within painting from the late 1950s, early 1960s in America. In this example, we can see the simplification of both the artist and also the model, and also most of the interior space. What I think is particularly interesting is when you look at the relationship of the model and actually what is on the painting. And you'll notice that although the model is on a white wall, Matisse has chosen to paint the wall black within the space of the painting. Around 1917, we see him almost take a step back towards realism, with the incorporation again of people's faces, and still highly, highly stylized, but we get more of a sense of the individual rather than just a form like we witnessed in the previous painting. When we look at paintings like the music lesson from 1917, we almost see the entire family sitting within this space. Again, this sense of stylization that we have, and the open window space that Matisse uses so much, spilling in terms of information into the foreground as well. When we see his self-portrait from 1918, we see the synthesis again of the work that he's doing at this time. This sense of stylization, but we're also moving back in a sense towards realism, but still these wonderful blocks of color like the red that we have in the lower right part of the painting. We also have this amazing sense of line that he's starting to redevelop in this version of the odalisque that he did, where again the color and the pattern of the clothing and the blanket are as important as the figure we're actually looking at. He also begins to create a very rich and interesting interior, like Woman with the Goldfish Bowl, where we have this design of blue that almost seems to dominate as much as the table and the woman staring at the goldfish. Another example of how he's using color in almost a depressing fashion. Moving forward, we have this wonderful family scene that is just all about pattern, from the boys playing a game of checkers to the tablecloth to every little part. It's this explosion of different colors and patterns that Matisse would have had within his home. From the 1930s, we see a change in Matisse's work and also his life as he divorces his wife after an affair that he had around 1932. We also see the transformation in terms of the scale and ideas within his work. When we look at Pink Nude from 1935, we have this eschewment of the proportions of the woman's body. It's this massive, massive pink body in this space. And what he's doing within this is he's playing off the idea of organic lines versus rectilinear, with her laying on this blue fabric or ground that almost has like graph paper design to it, directly creating a juxtaposition between the form of that and the woman. We continue to see the usage of these incredibly bright colors, and again using this pink to denote human skin, which kind of gives this sensation of joy within the space of the pink woman that we just looked at, but a continuation into just the basic paintings that he's doing. When we look at something like interior with an Etruscan vase, we have that same sense, and we look at the background and we see either a mirror or a painting with this wonderful splash of color to balance out the greens and the simple tones that are there in the foreground. In the 1940s, Matisse had to have surgery due to cancers that he had formed in his abdomen. From this point, he was bedridden for a number of years. He was actually nursed by a woman by the name of Monique Bourgeois, who will become important to a later piece of art that he creates. But from here, since he was essentially immobilized, he started to create a new form of art where he would take prepared pieces of paper that have been gouache painted by his assistants, and he would create his famous collage cutouts. One of the first creations he did in this style was the Jazz Book from 1943 that was limited to 250 copies. In this, I see a lot of the ideas that we saw in kind of the last period of his painting, where he's using one overall color to kind of give the thematic of the room. In some ways, these are just simplified versions of, I think, the moods that he was trying to generate with some of his other paintings. He'll go on to do small pieces like this for the Jazz Book, but he'll also create these larger colossal pieces out of these collage forms, and this becomes a major point of his work going forward at the end of his life. And when we view the paintings from this last period of his life, you'll notice the amazing intensity of color that he's now using. Again, he was doing this before, but now instead of these subtle tones, this jarring red that both goes within the interior and exterior of the space. We see this again with Large Red Interior from 1948, where it's almost like the Red Studio paintings, where we have this red, almost this pumped Pompeian red that goes throughout the entire room, with paintings then on the wall. In this particular painting, the painting that we see on the wall is actually the pineapple, and I found a representation of that, but it very much looks like it was created in the exact same period as the red interior, again with that very, very stark crimson type of red permeating throughout most of the work. In honor of the nurse Monique Bourgeois, who helped him recover from his surgeries, he actually created a church, a chapel, and dedicated it to her. The amazing thing about the Matisse Chapel is just the fact that he not only designed the interior, he designed the stained glass windows, he designed almost every single little aspect of the chapel. Here's a shot of the interior, and you'll see what he's done is he's left the walls white and bare, but then he's paired them with these stained glass windows that should provide the light and the color for the blank white walls that we're actually looking at. Here's another shot of the interior, and you can see it's a very small, very intimate chapel, but the windows are clearly designed by Matisse with, again, these very large, beautiful shapes, very much coming out of his period of doing the cutouts, as we've just seen previously. Here's a shot of the altar, and as I mentioned, you can see the effect that he's going for here with, again, the white blank area and then the stained glass window reflecting its light over onto the white figure. It's a very interesting way of creating an interior. It should also be noted that in addition to the stained glass windows and the interior design, Matisse also created a series of priest vestments to be worn by the people who are actually giving the mass there at the chapel. It's this complete package that he's actually created, and some of these vestments are absolutely gorgeous. And again, use this the cutout style that he had been doing with his collages, but it has now just been transferred over to fabric and material to create these amazing vestments that again are just amazing works of art by themselves.